Welcome everyone to the Robert H. Jackson Center and our program Radio Remembrances. We're glad to be inside tonight, as outside it is one of the least desirable kind of climate situations that we have in Jamestown, but as our illustrious moderator often quotes the famous Marv Levy, where else would you rather be than right here, right now? We look forward to hearing some familiar voices tonight. Voices that are recognized by generations of local residents. And as recently as 11 o'clock today at my office, the Chautauqua Region Community Foundation, we had a visitor who remarked on one of the voices you're going to hear from as soothing and something that they always look forward to. But before we pivot to the story of radio in Jamestown, let's set the stage with a bit of history of radio in America. And I have borrowed this quite liberally from PBS's American Experience on the Development of Radio. Marconi is credited with transmitting the very first wireless signals. We all learned that when we're in elementary school. But those signals, coded as dots and dashes, would have meant nothing if Canadian-born physicist Reginald Fessenden, perhaps related to our own local Fessendens, I don't know, hadn't collaborated with Ernst Alexanderson from General Electric, eventually sending the first long-distance transmission of human voice and music in 1906. More inventions and patents followed, which allowed the radio frequency signals to be amplified dramatically, and AM transmissions became widespread by 1920. What followed was a 30-year period referred to as the golden age of radio. And actually, in your hands, you have a program from 1937, which was right in the middle of that golden age. Roughly 40% of American homes contained a radio, and families accessed both news and entertainment crowded around a vacuum tube console in their modest homes. Radio faced its first existential threat in the 1950s, when a combination of television and FM radio broadcasts diminished the traditional AM radio audience and advertising revenue. But AM radio pivoted, giving up broadcasting the same programs all over the country to stations that individually adopted specialized formats, such as regional and local news, sports, and talk programs. Eventually, the battle between FM and AM radio faded, as both faced threats from satellite radio and more recently podcasts. There have been predictions of the end of radio dating back to the 1930s, when RCA was pushing for the development of the television. Yet here we are in 2025, and we're still listening. Why? Because of those voices. Those voices are treasured friends, even if we've never seen the face behind the voice. We trust that voice because it belongs to someone who cares about our community, someone who takes pride in giving accurate, timely accounts of the things that matter to us. In times of struggle and strife, we turn to those voices for reassurance. And tonight, we're going to sit and enjoy being together and listening to some of our favorite voices share stories and accounts of their shared history of radio in Jamestown. To get us started, please turn your attention to the screen for an introduction given by a voice that needs no introduction, Dennis Webster.
I need to go back to that celebratory night, December 31st, 1924. How special it was in another way. The Jamestown Evening Journal on January 1st, 1925, reported this: modern invention served to advertise the opening of the hotel by means of the new broadcasting station in Jamestown. The orchestra music and the rest of the program was spread far and wide over the country for the benefit of the radio fans. Those who turned in Jamestown heard the brief speeches better than those in the room. Radio broadcasting in Jamestown began simultaneously with the new hotel on New Year's Eve, 1924. Just a few days before, December 27th, local entrepreneur Archibald E. Newton, Archie, had received U.S. government permission to turn his experimental radio station, 8DIS, into a full-time one WOCL. We're on Chautauqua Lake. 12 years after Archie Newton got into the radio business, he got out of it. WOCL was sold to a group of experienced broadcasters from Syracuse. The call letters were changed to WJTN. WJTN moved into the front section of this, the second floor of the hotel, in the fall of 1939, and remained here until leaving for Orchard Road, the current location, in 1971. It is worth noting that one of the people who came with the Syracuse team was a salesman, a quite successful one. He eventually became manager and later owner of WJTN. His name is worthy of mention, Cy Goldman. Cy led WJTN through its most successful years on the air. His son, Mike, joins us on the panel today.
It's a good project. And that's Tori's introduction as that smooth, soothing voice. I know that it's probably not the one that I know the longest, Mike Goldman. So with that, Mike, you were introduced here by Dennis. And the event, we did it for honoring the 100th anniversary of the Hotel Jamestown. And clearly, your introduction was a continuum of something that occurred in 1936 and 37 in Jamestown with your dad.
Yeah.
You want to give a little background there?
Sure. Dad, you want to go back? He was born in Carthage, New York. Never mind. He went to Syracuse University. He went to Syracuse University, and after he finished there, he went to work for WSYR as a salesman. Of course, he was young. He was unattached, and they purchased a radio station in Jamestown, New York. So they wanted to send somebody down there to sort of be part of that radio station. So they picked a young kid that had no ties to Syracuse, New York, and sent him down here. And as they say, and that's the end of the story because he stayed. And, you know, as time went on, of course, as Greg mentioned, he went from a salesman to sales manager to general manager to owner. And that's where he ended up. And he enjoyed his life here immensely.
Mike, you grew up here. You're a Jamestown native because of everything you've just told us about. Did your dad bring you and your family to the station? Was that part of your world?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I spent a lot of time there. You know, I remember I used to go, especially, well, Saturday morning was, Dad used to sneak, I shouldn't say sneak, excuse me. He used to go out and do things. In the winter, sometimes he went bowling. He'd go visit whomever. And one of the things he did, he'd go to the radio station. So I knew and met all of the radio personalities and some of the others. You know, I was thinking as I read J. Ralph Carlson's little story, there's some people that didn't get mentioned because they were in the background. But they were the heart and soul of the radio station. And one person I remember is Sarah Paternini. Did you know Sarah?
Yes,
Yeah,
I did.
You did. Okay. Dennis is only a year younger than me, but I got to ask these questions. And she was in charge of what they call traffic, which means that she basically wrote the radio advertising and put it on the schedule so that it would get done. But what I remember, she was like a grandmother to me. You know, and every time I went, I wanted to see her. And, you know, so that's one of the memories that's there is her. And, you know, and I used to go, I mean, I remember going in and talking to Jim Roselli while he was on the air. You know, it just happened.
You a guest?
I guess I was a guest. I don't know. Maybe it was like he couldn't say no.
Did your dad have before we get into the rest of the panel here, but your dad have a sense that at some point he'd like you to, as a successor, in the radio business, or was like, Mike, go do what's best for you?
Well, the answer is no. My brother Paul did end up in the radio business. But it never, excuse me, it was never, I always felt that I needed to do something different. I didn't want to, I hate to say it, but I didn't want to be known as Cy Goldman's son. Okay, I wanted to do something different, and so I went another direction, obviously. I went to law school and...
At
still-
Syracuse, have you
At
heard of that
Syracuse,
yet?
yeah. I didn't mind using him to get into Syracuse, by the way. I didn't mind being his son then. But, yeah, so, and then I went into practice of law. But my brother, you know, I mean, he was interested in radio from day one, and, I mean, he went to Syracuse. In fact, all three kids went to Syracuse. But then he went to Burlington, Vermont, to work at a radio station there that Dad owned, and he did the same thing my father did. He worked his way up, so he became the owner of that radio station.
How about your sister? Was there an interest there?
No. I don't ever remember any interest that she had. In fact, yeah, no. She was an artist. That was her interest.
Similar vein, Dennis, you came here because your dad getting a job at WJTN through really George Flieger, as I recall. And the only reason I know this is I had a great interview, it was extemporaneous, with you that I listened to again minutes ago. So if it seems like I really have this great knowledge, it's only because I was re-listening to our interview. But really that time period, but similarly, you kind of grew up on the radio. Did your dad take you there a lot?
Oh, sure. I mean, we were on the second floor of the Hotel Jamestown at that time. The entire front end of the building was WJTN, and my brother and I went up there a lot. And we saw the Goldman kids in and out on Saturday mornings, and sometimes in the early morning when my father, Doc Webster, was on the air, 5 o'clock or 5:30 till 8:30 or 9 o'clock, very early time period. My brother and I, he'd be on the air, my brother and I'd be in the building running around, playing at the microphones and running in and out of the studios. And it was just like a play place for us. And we had a lot of fun in there. And there was one of the engineers at one point who hooked it up so that my brother could sit in one studio and I could sit in another one. We'd talk to each other. We were, 5, 6, 7, 8 years old. We were just agog that we could do that. And there was a kind of mystery and excitement to the whole place up there, that and an intensity to radio at that time that was very compelling. I mean, you got in and it felt kind of exciting. That, there's a kind of a throb to it that was, I think, certainly caught my interest, obviously. I spent a lifetime doing it, my brother to a certain extent too, and I think many other people. I want to add a Cy Goldman story here, and we could fill the entire hour with Cy Goldman stories. Diminutive man, not particularly tall. He had a distinctive voice and an incredibly effective manner. He was gifted with the ability to sell things, to encourage people to see the world from his point of view. Am I doing this right? Yep. What you wrote for me, Mike. But so we're talking about, and I don't remember the exact year, but Cy told the story once in an interview for the archive at SUNY Fredonia. He was going to be transferred. He was not yet in a position where he could dictate what happened to the radio station. The Syracuse people were still involved, and he was going to be sent someplace else. And the employees wanted him to be the manager so much they had a strike. There was something of a sit-down strike where nobody worked or did minimal work until Cy was announced to be the station manager. And he was, I don't know, under 35 at this point in his career, but they wanted Cy there because he was that good at it and that good with the people.
You, like around 1970 or so, I'm just reading from this article that appeared in the 75th anniversary piece, and it talks about a year before, which would have been 1970, Dennis Webster, son of WJTN farm director Doc Webster, began his career at WJTN answering the phone and dubbing commercials part-time while in high school. And you remember being interested in radio as early as 4 years old. Where did the author of this come up with all this information?
I must have told it to him. Now, I will say this, and then I'll open the mic to Terry here. But you know where the DMV is in Jamestown now, if you're a local person on 3rd Street there, which in my youth was an A&P market, was a grocery store. And my mother used to shop there, and I would tag along with her, my brother too. And on one wall of the store, there was kind of a built-up office with some, you couldn't see right into it. There were some barriers around it, shelving or something like that. And on the other side, in the office, was a radio, and I heard my father's voice on the radio while we were shopping at the store. I thought, wow, isn't that something? I know where he's sitting and talking right now, and you can hear him in the same instant in this grocery store. And that is essentially the captivation of radio that I have lived my entire life.
Terry, you similarly are a local native, a native.
Yes.
You went to Southwestern?
Yep.
And tell me a little bit about your backstory here.
Well, when I was a junior in high school, I was kind of wondering about what I wanted to do with the rest of my life. And I would watch Erie TV once in a while, in addition to Buffalo and all the others. And there was a guy on the Erie station who was a sportscaster who was absolutely terrible. And I said, I can do this better than this guy. So I decided that I was going to go in that direction. And when I got to Jamestown Community College, I was involved in founding of WJCC at the time, working with Dennis Drew, Steve Gustafson, Steve Prevesque. And after that, I went on to Brockport and finished up at Oswego, which had a similar communications program to what they have at Syracuse. In fact, Oswego alum famously would say, hey, we're better than Syracuse. Newhouse doesn't have anything over us. So I got out of college, was trying to figure out what I wanted to do, and I ended up getting a call one day from Dennis Drew of 10,000 Maniacs fame. And Dennis was working at WNAE in Warren, Pennsylvania, and he was getting ready to go out on tour with the Maniacs. So they needed somebody to fill in on weekends, and I said, yeah, sure. I went down, interviewed with Dave Whipple, and ended up there for about a year, and then I heard about an opening at JTN and interviewed for that job with Steve Schulman, and the rest was history, aside from about three years and 10 months at WALL in Middletown, New York, which for those of you wondering where that is, it's about 20 miles due west of West Point.
Now, when you were out there, it seems to me I've heard the story when Dennis was retiring about he connecting with you, and that during that hiatus out there near West Point, and tell that story.
Yeah, well, there's a little bit of a backstory to that. The first 3 years at WALL went very well. I enjoyed myself. I was sports director, doing some news, and then the owner of the station got into some financial difficulty. And with that, he ended up being the victim, so to speak, of a hostile takeover by a subsidiary of Orange and Rockland Utilities. Produced a lot of controversy in the town down there. Anyways, there were a lot of things that changed. It became very corporate. And I had had enough at one point. And I started looking around, and Mike McKay, who was a newscaster at WJTN for a couple of years, I think, before he went back to Buffalo, Mike and I hooked up, and we were trying to get me in maybe part-time at like WGR or something like that. And it didn't work out, but then I went up to my room. I had a studio apartment in Middletown at that time. And I come into the room, my studio efficiency, and I play back the phone messages, and there's Dennis saying, "Terry, if you're interested, we have an opening in news at WJTN." And I got hold of Dennis, I believe, and then I got hold of Steve and Merrill Rosen, and I came back. And I have now been back. This coming year, later, will be 36 years plus that I've been back. I was at JTN 4 years and 5 months the first time around, so it'll be 40 years that I've been back.
That's modest compared to everybody else.
Yeah, 45
what's your
years in
point, Terry?
commercial radio.
Do you remember why you called? Why'd you reach out to Terry?
I think I was still part of the management at that time. My roles at WJTN shifted over the years, and I think I was still part of the management, and we were looking for somebody in news, and I had known Terry before.
Yeah.
And made the
Michelle
call.
Colvin was leaving. She got married to Rich Foster, and they live in Florida now.
Mm-hmm.
In 1977, George Flieger hired Dennis to work the overnight shift and announce the morning newscast. Later, he became the FM operations manager. Stereo was added in 1972 to WJTN FM, and the call letters were changed to WWSC. This is early morning stuff. Overnight, early morning. I mean, with your dad, he was part of the farm show, which was 6, 5 o'clock. I don't know how early it was. And by the way, talk about the farm show. I see Norm Carlson is here. And if you haven't read, and Norm, I hope you share at some point, he sent to me a long, as Norm can do, email about his remembrances being on the farm and listening to your dad and all the various WJTN stories. So, but that was part of your world too, Dennis.
Well, let me say this about my dad, since we're doing this for the record. He had lost his job in the summer of 1951 at a radio station in St. Johnsbury, Vermont. Our mother was 8 months and 3 weeks pregnant with my older brother. And my father was on a bus going from community to community across New York State trying to find an announcing job. He went to one of the stations in Buffalo, and they said, "We don't have anything for you here, but try down in Jamestown." There must have been some connection there. So he came to Jamestown and was hired by George Flieger, who also hired me. He was the program director at that time, hired my wife, who's in the audience today and worked at the radio station for many years as well. So in late July of 1951, my dad came here. He was a man of extraordinary ability. All you need to do to get a sense of that is to listen to my father's recapitulation of the day of the funeral of Robert H. Jackson here in Jamestown, and you will understand his talent and his ability as a writer and as a speaker. And he was beloved by the community and the audience here. And he did get up very early in the morning for 4:30. He was on the air at 5:30 for his entire career. The tragedy of my father's life, because he was so good at what he did and so beloved of the community, is he died at age 59, quite abruptly. As I have said to a number of people, not in such formal circumstances, as Salem cigarettes killed my father. You know, waking up at that hour of the day and working odd hours and all of that, he was an inveterate smoker. And he had complications from cigarette smoking, several diseases active at the same time, and he just dropped dead. And it was an extraordinary tragedy for the community and for me too. I was in my first semester at Syracuse University, and it was one of the most incredible stumbles of my adolescence to recover from that. It brought me home here, brought me back to the radio station, may have helped ensure that my career would be here as opposed to anywhere else. But yeah, it's quite a family story, and my brother and I talk about it all the time. My older brother is does not live in this community, he lives in South Carolina, but he's been deeply involved in radio in other ways in terms of ham radio and things like that, and emergency services. But we talk about it all the time in terms of the powerful impact that he had through a short period of time on our lives.
So did you feel like you were carrying on the torch of the farm show? I mean, when you got that assignment, was that kind of a Doc Webster legacy, or did you change the concept?
Wow, Greg, now let me see if I could do this without tearing up, but the fulfillment, maybe a lifetime fulfillment of an extraordinary grief, was to do what my father did.
Yep.
Terry, you likewise came back, and did you know what they wanted you to do when you came back? Or did you have any say in the matter? Or, you know, you were a sportscaster. You did a little bit
It's
of
radio, you have no say. In terms of what I was going to do, I knew precisely what I was going to be doing, and that was come back and do the 4 to 11 news shift, which is what Michelle Colvin had done prior to my arrival. And I got back and did that, and at the time, Haphazard was news director. Sheila, Dennis's wife, was a morning person for the news, and she eventually became my news director for a few years.
And because of that stress, she left. I mean,
I don't think I pushed her out, but
I do. This is one of the things I remember, because I likewise native here, was the WJTN editorials, which were given by Cy.
Right.
And I was always curious when Cy spoke, people listened. And they were sometimes sunshine, lollipop things, you know, feeling good, give to the United Way, the community chest, you know, support, rah, rah, that's all warm and fuzzy. But every once in a while, you'd dive in, he would dive into something controversial and would take a stance. And I always marveled at that, but on 2 points. One, doing it, and two, who wrote it? Did Cy sit down and write it?
No, haphazard. The answer is the news director.
Yep.
What would happen is, I say the news director, I mean, you know, it was a very democratic situation. If anybody at the radio station had something that was of interest, you know, Dad would listen. And after he passed, and I started doing the editorials, it was the same thing. But, you know, somebody would write the editorial, you know, they'd go to Dad, they'd say, this is what we think. Or, as you say, sometimes it was the rah-rah thing. He said, well, we really ought to promote this, or we really ought to promote that. But, no, he didn't write them. Somebody else wrote them for him. Same thing with me, by the way. I didn't write any either.
But somebody had to not, he doesn't speak it unless he believes it. And therefore, the idea that germinates someplace, and then there's the words, there's the guys who can wordsmith it. Is that you saw too, Dennis? Did you get involved in that?
I'm so happy you brought up the WJTN editorial, because it is something that is relevant to the history of the radio station and relevant to this moment. We're speaking on the 10th of April, 2025. The first WJTN editorial was 1957. We are happy at this time to bring you the first WJTN editorial. These editorials are prepared by the WJTN editorial board and voiced by Cy Goldman, president of WJTN. Here is Mr. Goldman with today's statement of editorial opinion by WJTN. Cy is not here to read his part of it. His son is. I don't know if I want to make Mike read this or not, but you can just like pick up the first graph or two where it says Goldman there, Mike, and then we can talk about this a little bit. You can read it.
All right, sure. The Chautauqua County Board of Supervisors is considering a program for county sponsorship of Jamestown Community College. Under the present setup, the city of Jamestown sponsors the college and provides half the funds for capital expenses at the school. The other half comes from the state. Operating expenses are borne by the students themselves, the student's home city or town, and the state of New York. Each pays, wow, $270 a year for each student. Jamestown's share goes directly to the college. County funds are provided for those living outside the city, but townships involved are billed later.
This gets into considerable length, so I don't want to put Mike on the spot by reading the whole thing. But that's the first WJTN editorial, October 3rd and 4th, 1957. And think about this for a moment. Cy was a businessman. He could have easily said, I'm not going to do anything with editorials. I don't want to offend anybody. You know, you look at this pamphlet that I left today, 54 advertisers sponsored the NBC, first NBC Blue broadcast on WJTN. There were probably that many, or twice as many by 1957 advertisers on the air. He could have said, I'm not going to have anything to do with this. But he had the forethought and the care for the community that once radio stations were allowed to begin doing editorials, he was, according to the station's history, one of the first 15 in the country to do so. And he could have easily not taken a stand on Jamestown Community College or the countless other things. There are books, binders of WJTN editorials still in the archive up there at WJTN's, where I found this earlier today. Thank you, Mike. And the courage that it took, the journalistic responsibility is really laudable for your dad. And I don't know that that's something that's really brought up enough about Cy Goldman, because we live in an era at this moment when people who could stand up and speak about something and could do so with passion and reason are not. And look back 68 years to this man, your dad, who did. And people liked it. Norm Herbie, Republican, big Republican in Jamestown for many years. Dear Cy, I want to write to you to express my pleasure in hearing your forceful and penetrating editorials. It's my considered opinion that your editorials evidence the clearest thinking in Jamestown at the present time. Agnes Alstrom, longtime Republican elections commissioner in Chautauqua County. You did it again this morning, Cy. And I practically screamed, attaboy, as I listened, coming to Mayville in the car. The editorials are direct and refreshing and hard-hitting and most effective. I'll stop, get off my high horse here, but thank you for bringing up the WJTN editorial.
I also think it's kind of interesting that we have JCC the way it is today. I mean, he does the editorial and somebody listened.
Nelson Gariffi is in the audience, and I confirmed with him when I got here that county support took a few years, till 1996, from 1957 to 1996 before it actually happened.
And it's interesting because that same topic comes up now on various projects that JCC is talking about, because it's this, lack of a better term, trifurcation of funding sources that they have to go through, state, county, and then private, and that's similarly the same issue here. And the county supervisors is no longer, it's, we have a county executive.
County legislature, yeah.
And Terry, you similarly have a community program, which you do weekly. And do you find yourself at times where similarly you can have topics of United Way, the Community Foundation, which is all feeling good. Thank you, Tori, for doing this tonight. But at the same time, sometimes you got topical matters and people that might be a little hot button stuff. How do you handle that?
Well, that's kind of interesting. I try not to think too much about it. I do have the county executive come in for the first weekend of the month, and Mayor Kim Eklund comes in during the second week. In fact, I interviewed Kim for this weekend's program today. And there are hot button issues, hot button topics, but, we try to do a variety of things. Like you said, United Way, Community Foundation. We've also had people on from the YWCA with the domestic violence and empowering women issues. It's mainly an issues public service type of program. And it's 15 minutes. It flies by real quick.
There was a period of time, again, I'm dating myself, but where the Melva Webbers and the Ray Halls and others had the call-in, which was, now it's not you selecting a topic or somebody, and it's very specific as to an individual topic without the point counterpoint. Did that create, I mean, that's new programming in a sense, because now you get somebody calling, and Norm Carlson could call the next time and have a counterpoint. I mean, that's just the way that went. In the station itself, was that easily adapted, or was were there moments?
The history of that kind of program goes back a long time on WJTN. I remember in my youth listening to George Flieger do a program called Opinion Please, which was essentially a call-in show where I don't think the calls were screened at all. If they were minimally screened. There was no delay. At a certain point in the in the time of doing those kinds of programs, there was originally a tape delay and then a digital delay, so that if somebody got on there and started spouting off or using words that were not appropriate for the radio station, because it was in delay, you could just press a button and the last 10 seconds would disappear, and then the delay would start building that up again, so that there was some safety in that. But I think in a tamer era, they just took those calls. It had a long history on WJTN. It required, like a lot of other things, it required appropriate talent to do it, somebody at the desk to handle the calls, and in the later years, we would have somebody, Republican and Democrat, conservative and liberal, point, counterpoint, right in the room to take on these issues. And I think two things happened. One, it gets expensive to maintain all those people to do a 2-hour show, and they kind of had a life where they would come and there would be new callers and fresh material coming up all the time, and then you'd get the same people, the same issues that came up again and again and again. And then it became something that was less inviting for the listener.
I'm sorry, Greg, if I may.
Of course.
One of the things that my father, that was very important to my father, was the public service aspect of radio. As everybody knows, the Federal Communications Commission requires that there be some public service, and you actually have to file and everything else. But I firmly believe that a lot of the success of WJTN, besides the great radio personalities that we had, is the fact that it was a community-oriented organization. And I mean, there was complete access for public service announcements. I still remember, I don't remember if it was you, Dennis, or somebody else, but you had a whole bunch of 3x5 cards, right? Terry, yeah. A whole bunch of 3x5 cards with community service that would be read at various times during the show. So I think that program comes out of that community spirit, if you will, that I actually drove the radio station at that time.
Programmatically, I'm trying to pull back the curtain here. All the three of you in various forms have been there. So as you laid out the day's agenda, the news, the weather, the community, the sports, the Pete Hubble shows and the Max Robinsons and all that, was that a group effort? Who kind of laid out that, or was it, we would have this time, this slots, this period of time? Was it a group? I'm visualizing sitting around a table and doing that, but maybe I'm completely wrong.
Well, it's good you bring this up, Greg, because as I used to say often when I was in the management and younger, radio's a business, not an art form. Just to remind those people, particularly such as I was when I first walked in the door, who wanted to have fun with this and to do great things. that you also needed to be responsible to the business aspect of it. So many of the variety of programs that ended up on WJTN and sustained for a period of time were there because advertisers would support them. Someone would pay for Jack Dunnigan to go down to Lowbox. And if you don't know Jack Dunnigan and you don't know Lowbox, we'll talk after. Country music artist of great fame, and a discount store in Brooklyn Square, and he would go down there and sit among the lamps and the tables and the chairs and do a radio broadcast every day because they were willing to sustain that. Jim Roselli would be on remote broadcasts all over town because people were willing to hire him to help them market their business. So a lot of what happened on that schedule, in addition, and you are correct in speaking to your dad and everybody else who was in the management in the Goldman era, that they were deeply committed to public service and wanting to do the right things for the community and needing to have enough revenue to do so.
I can still recall living in Allen Park and seeing the Klieg lights in the evenings coming from 2nd Street, and there'd be a remote by Jim Roselli at Joe Caprino's, where the best cost less, and on and on.
Buy before midnight tonight. You may never hear this again.
Yeah. And it was unbelievable. And there's a picture, and I was trying to quickly find it, of, yeah, here it is, right here. For those who can see this full double page, Cy Goldman and Joe Caprino, and they won an award for from Sylvania's Outstanding Radio Marketing. But similarly, when you had advertisers who were willing to have an idea, I'm visualizing some of the crazy antics that occurred when in fact, sometimes you'd have radio announcers maybe up on a roof or in a crane or doing things like Caprino with the Klieg light. Anything comes to mind where it's like, Greg, you're not going to believe how we actually listened to the advertiser and we actually did this? Maybe a 24-hour marathon or something like that?
Jay Philippi was a very talented announcer who was on WWSE, SE93, for a number of years. And they suspended him. There's a picture on the wall at WJTN now of him in a trailer suspended above McFadden Ford on Washington Street, where he was stuck for 24 or 36 hours or until they sold a certain number of cars or something like that. And he would get on the air and broadcast from there. And that's the first thing that comes to my mind. There were others. We used to, just as a public service, I don't know if we ever made any money at it, but every year we would announce the time to light the 4th of July, light the flares around Chautauqua Lake. Yep. 10 o'clock. Right. Wait to light the flare. 10 official signal will come on WJTN. We were all over the county doing those things, from hot air balloons up in the middle of the night and boats on the lake and just all kind of wild things like that.
Well, I can also remember you had remotes, you had the barbecues, you had, where in fact, I forget,
Yep.
I don't know if that was Roselli, but somehow they came to your house.
The WJTN party.
Yep.
Yeah.
And the Saturday breakfast party. This guy right here.
Well, that is such a long run, Dennis. Could we spend just a moment on kind of its genesis, of which you then picked up and ran for eons?
Post-World War II, a lot of excitement in the community, development, growth. Half the staff of WJTN, male members in particular, were sent to the service. Cy and George among them. They were in the Signal Corps together, as I recall, and overseas and all of that, and back, and a great deal of enthusiasm. And one very talented and charismatic man named Marshall Shantz, who later changed his name to Rex Marshall, was an announcer at WJTN. He got together with some people in sales, and Fred Bigelow, as I recall, from the Bigelow family, and created Breakfast with Bigelow's, originally a studio-done program, and eventually they invited people into the coffee shop of the Hotel Jamestown, later the main dining room there, to celebrate birthdays and talk about community events on the air. And Breakfast with Bigelow's eventually became the Saturday breakfast party when Bigelow's gave up full sponsorship of it. And it ran from 1946 to 2020, and then it kind of died out with the pandemic. And I had been on the show for, I guess I'd run it for 40 years, hosted it for 40 years. And it, as I mentioned earlier, everything has its time, and then it begins to go. And you know, some of what we did there, it was dwindling interest and harder to keep it going. And then the pandemic kind of put the lid on all of it. But it was very homespun, very community-oriented, and very friendly. It was not the most highly produced radio program that you will ever hear, but it was very much about Jamestown and very much about the people who wanted to come in there and be on the air and celebrate or talk about things or just be there.
Well, similarly, this book has got another picture of way back when, 1956, the Saturday Breakfast Club with Max Robinson and Ray Fram,
Ray Frame, engineer.
John Horan, Max Robinson as announcers. This goes back, but similarly, you know, is it hard to know when to say when on programs like that? I mean, you all have had your signature programs, but do you know when it's comfortable to do, but at the same time to know that it's time to maybe pivot?
Probably 3 months, 6 months, a year before you actually do it. Because we had a tendency of holding on to these things just because they were a part of our image and a part of who we were, and we didn't want to disappoint people if they would go. Eventually, that the revenue was not there to sustain them. A very fine example of that is a program that was called the Radio Scrapbook. Now, 2 program directors for WJTN, George Flieger, who was the program director at the time, and a very talented musician, by the way. The members of the Flieger family are just, he had perfect pitch and could play the piano and the organ like nobody. I mean, he just could sit down and play and play and play. And J. Ralph Carlson, the program director who preceded him, would come in and read poetry. They recorded these programs in advance. It ran for like 7 or 8 minutes, Monday through Friday mornings at 20 minutes after 7 o'clock. Now, J. Ralph's selection of poetry, this was not Yeats or Shakespeare. It was more of the kind of common poetry that you would find in magazines and things like that. So it was seasonal, not particularly inspired, and that ran for years and had substantial sponsorship, and then it began to dwindle away. And I remember the talk inside the station, what do we do about the Radio Scrapbook? Because we could do other things in this time period, generate more revenue. And eventually they did decide to take it off the air, to the chagrin of many of the people who loved the thing and just felt as though it was a part of their morning to hear J. Ralph speak and George play. And that's what radio often did or does to people. You get used to the schedule and the voices, and something goes away when something is broken when that disappears. And that was the sense then. And I probably shouldn't say this, but I guess all the other parties are no longer with us. Their decision at the time was that they would take the Radio Scrapbook off the air, but if there was an occasion or some reason to bring it back, at least for a short-term basis, they would. They never did. No. But they made a promise to people that maybe there will be another opportunity.
Part of it, too, is a lot of these programs were personality-driven. So if you lose the personality, that sometimes, would change the idea of whether or not that program would continue.
Along those lines, the name that hasn't been dropped yet, but needs to be dropped, is Jim Roselli. And from a programmatic viewpoint and on so many other fronts, but when you talk about programs and personality and relationships, you have Jim Roselli and Chautauqua Institution.
Right.
And that was really his signature piece. And we had many, but that's the one most people could listen to in the morning, the longest during the summer. Can either of you speak to what the genesis of that was? How did Jim connect to that?
Charlie Goodell
Okay.
and Jim Roselli were classmates, Jamestown High School. And Jim, there are those in the audience who know the story well, Jim went to the radio station when Charlie was going to make an address at Chautauqua Institution, and asked if he couldn't do a program from Chautauqua because Charlie was going to be there. Now, he may have been a senator by that point. He was a representative. He was well known and respected in the community. That got Jim in the gate. And suddenly it became obvious to him in a very short period of time there were many, many interesting people, known and lesser known, who walked up and down Webster Plaza on a weekday morning at Chautauqua Institution. And Jim was excitedly curious about life and the world and people, and he tapped into that and had such a easy, marvelously, seemingly unrehearsed way of pulling people in and talking to them and putting them at ease with a light breeze and a bird singing in the background. But he had these people, famous people from the Congress and the United Nations and some of the greatest diplomats and scientists in the world, and they were at Chautauqua and they were relaxed, and Jim was getting stuff out of them that they probably wouldn't have said if they were under the hot lights at CBS in New York. But they're there with Jim at Chautauqua, and he put them at ease, and they just talked. And that went on for 73 or 4 until Jim's death, which is 2016, as I recall.
Tucker, Terry, you may have seen it, of Jim's not only curiosity, but his willingness to research the subject.
Yes. Sometimes I would be at the Prendergast Library here in Jamestown, and I would run into Jim over there, and he'd be researching people who are coming to Chautauqua, reading up, magazine this.
One of his favorite phrases.
Yeah. And, it was always interesting talking with him about who he was going to be interviewing at Chautauqua, Sandra Day O'Connor, Roger Goodell. We think about him as, the NFL commissioner, but he does have deep family ties here. And, it was really fascinating because I sat the board for a lot of those Chautauqua remotes. And I remember sometimes we would have to set aside a certain amount of time that would conflict with network responsibilities at the top of the hour. And so we'd have to move things around a little bit and such. But his ability to interview, like Dennis said, and draw things out from people was second to none.
The other thing, too, is, and Dennis and Terry are an example of that. You don't just go on the air, turn the microphone on, and start talking. The amount of research, the amount of time, the amount of effort taken to get there, that's what makes these people the great professionals that they were and are.
And we've all experienced it. And I was just curious because you two are really good interviewers. And is there certain skill sets that you may have learned from Jim, either by he being a mentor or observation or osmosis? I don't know the word, but...
We watched your interviews, Greg, and that's how we learned to do it.
Yeah, okay. That aside,
Curiosity.
yeah.
Curiosity. Why did you propose this? Why do you want to do that? It's the who, what, when, why, and where of journalism.
Well, and I think we learned from Jim that everybody is interesting. Everybody has a story to tell, and if you can make them comfortable and listen to what they say to you, you can gain something from that perhaps brief interaction that you can then use to draw a picture, paint in a picture that will be of value to somebody else who's listening. And I heard Jim do that countless times at Chautauqua and elsewhere. Housewife. Jim used to do remotes from Loblaws. Anybody here remember Loblaws? Mm-hmm. And there were 3 Loblaws in the Jamestown area. He'd go one Loblaws to the next over time. And a shopper leaving the store with a bag full of groceries, having no intention of being on the radio, and having not a politician, not a professor, just a human being at the grocery store. And suddenly Jim is extracting from this person the most interesting details about their life and their family and what has meaning to them. And it was not only entertaining, it was inspiring.
They found form also on Saturday mornings. I don't know how many years you did this, times of your life, with Jim. I don't know if Jim did initially by himself, but certainly Jim and Russ for many years. And that was now an hour where they actually did not only the known and notables, but sometimes just the guy who had a memory of Brooklyn Square. I mean, it was those type of things.
Yeah.
There was someone who was well-known in the community, Ron Page. He worked in some businesses and advertising at the time. And it was his concept to do a show like that, as I recall. I mean, it gets some of the details not exactly right on this, but Ron had this idea that Jim could do a show. And I believe it was Ron at a certain point in the process of the development of this, or when it had been on for a while, a short while, that maybe Russ Dietrich and Jim would be good together in the studio. Little did they know. I mean, Jim and Russ had known each other for a long time, and they had been on the air together doing the famous Easter egg hunt broadcast from Allen Park for the city. Russ was, at that time, the Parks and Recreation Commissioner in Jamestown. So they knew each other, but they never really worked together. And it was a golden partnership that they, because Jim asked questions and thought about things in one way, and Russ another, and they were really very good together.
Yeah.
Personalities. Now, we've just, Jim, but during your time, because we're talking some total 150 plus years, were other personalities that were important to your life? Terry, I'm going to start with you. You know, as you look back as kind of people that influenced you.
Well, Dennis for one, Dennis's wife Sheila, Haphazard, Pete Hubble, former longtime sports director, Cy, Merrill Rosen. Everybody had a role to play, and they were able to execute it over a long period of time that I think was part of what drew people to the radio station. You know, you've known these people for a long time. I came back in September of 1989, so it's going on 36 years. People, it's funny, I run into people and they say, "Oh my gosh, you're that guy on the radio, you're Terry Frank. I thought you'd be taller." And I was like, sorry to disappoint you that I'm vertically challenged, but I get that every now and then.
See, similar to you, Dennis, as you know, you've mentioned a few in the course of this evening, but were there others that we probably have not mentioned that come to mind?
Well, first I want to put a point of emphasis on Hap. Almon, A-L-M-O-N, Hazard, 1Z. Because Hap, as he was known through most of his life, was kind of a quiet, behind-the-scenes sort of person. Not loud, not brassy, but he was a very good writer and reporter. And he wrote a lot of the news from 1954 till his retirement, and my wife would have to help me with the year that he retired, but for decades. And he was skilled, and he had high standards and knew the journalistic rules and taught them by what he did, and really established, I think, the foundation of WJTN News. We had a lot of other people writing the news there. To Manly Anderson, may be a name that some people in the audience remember. Manly wrote for the Post-Journal and part-time for us, and for many, many years, when I was first at the radio station, it was Hap and Manly. Now I'm going to drop one other name here because the time is getting short, and we have not said much about Archie Newton, but he deserves a moment or two here because it was Archie who got out of the service after World War I, had a curiosity and an interest in radio before, during, and after the war, and through much of 1924 was testing a variety of radio broadcast methods out of Jamestown, most of them from his home at 840 North Main Street. He had applied for what I'm led to believe from a 1949 article in the Jamestown Sun, a short-term radio license so that he could do broadcasts from the Hotel Jamestown as it opened New Year's Eve, 1924 into 1925. Instead, by some means, he got a full-time license and he found himself in the radio business. 1924, roaring 20s. I think it might have gone well for a while, but we all know what happened in 1929. There were many challenges in the 1930s. When he was interviewed for that 25th anniversary article in the Jamestown Sun about WJTN in 1949, you got the sense that he was happy to be done with the radio business. He was working at Art Metal at the time. It had nothing to do with communications. He was out of radio, excuse me, entirely, and happy to be out of it. But had he not started this and struggled to maintain it for the first 12 years before Colonel Denny, who came from Colonel Wilder from Syracuse, came with Cy and others from WSYR to pick up WOCL, turn it into WJTN, and make it a success. If he had not struggled through that first decade and a few more years, then we might not be here today. I mentioned Denny because he was the manager of the station at that time. Colonel Wilder was the president, and Charles Denny was the manager.
Back behind the scenes, you mentioned Ora Larson and Sarah Paterniti, and there's in this 5th anniversary, there's a whole pictures of a lot of people here. Did your dad rely heavily on that core group, and were they there for a long period of time? I'm thinking of Ora specifically.
Absolutely. That was one of my father's greatest assets, at least in my opinion, is his ability to deal with people and to get along with people. And I mean, if somebody came to work in a position at WJTN or James Broadcasting, they seem to have stayed forever. Merrill being a perfect example. I think he was, in fact, his story age-wise may be very close to my father's. Because I think he stayed, I know he worked at Dotson's before he went to the radio station, but he was early 20s, I think, when he went to work for the radio station, and he was there till he retired.
Speaking of Merrill Rosen, who started as a salesman, became sales manager, followed the size track in terms of eventually becoming the general manager of the radio station, and had very similar skills to Cy in terms of his ability to convince people to buy things or do things.
Merrill Rosen is the world's greatest salesman. He could sell anything to anybody.
Yes. The professional sells snow to a snowman. That was Merrill, and we all worked with him. And one of the things as we draw closure, and it reflected today on the fact that we have 3 incredibly talented people here who in their own professions, Mike even talked about his extensive and celebrated career as a lawyer, but you're all 3 natives. You are 3 natives from this area. And you've become the consummate professionals in your field, And yet at the same time, and this is, I think, a direct reflection of your dad, Mike, that you became engaged and involved outside of your profession within this community that you were serving, but also became part of and enhanced. I mean, there's examples galore of each of you. I have a file that I commend you to Google all three of these people to see what other activities that they have been engaged in, but it's quite remarkable, and it's always understated, and it's always out of the spotlight. Honestly, it's been hard to get all three of you guys in the same place at the same time, and I'm delighted to actually do this today. And I just want to thank you, but knowing full well that no broadcast ends without the announcers having the final word, as much as I've tried at other times when they've interviewed me, it never happens. It just doesn't happen. So similarly, I'm not going to have the final word. And so I'm just going to start with Terry, you, and just kind of give you a sense, perhaps, of your time. It continues, by the way. I don't mean, it's not a retirement party. It continues for Terry. But
I haven't retired yet.
over 40 years is unbelievable. But talk a little bit about, maybe as we wrap up here.
It's been a journey, to say the least. You know, I started out, I had no idea what I was going to do when I grew up, and I'm still kind of wondering, but when I referred to the guy in Erie, Pennsylvania, I say that kind of tongue-in-cheek because, you know, I thought I could do it. Did announcements at Southwestern a couple of times and then got into it at Jamestown Community College. And I think, you know, it kind of shows the fact that there are opportunities for people around here that would like to do something like that. My biggest fear right now is what's happening to AM radio and the fact that it's become very corporate, very syndicated. The other aspect, well, there are two actually. One is AI, what's going to happen with artificial intelligence. The other thing that you kind of worry about is, you know, what's going to happen to the community that you're part of. And, you know, when you cover news, I don't want to get heavy, but, you know, when you cover news, you see what's going on around you. And these are difficult times right now, and I think to my point of view, I would say that, you know, you need local broadcasters, people that follow what's going on with Congress, the state legislature, the Jamestown City Council, the county legislature, is as important now as it ever has been. And one of the things, too, that Dennis had brought up was the WJTN editorials. It used to be years ago that you would put on the screen on TV that this is an editorial. That requirement went away. Now you're getting editorialism, if that's a word, all the time, or quite often. And you need people who can sift through all that. And that's kind of where I come down on what I do. I mean, if I tick off the Democrats as much as I tick off the Republicans, I'm happy.
Dennis.
Well, three things quickly. One, I've been blessed to have the career that I've had, the opportunity to work with and know the people that I have known. It's been a wonderful experience. I'm happy to have had the opportunity to share it with friends here at the Robert H. Jackson Center today. I'll leave you with a Cy Goldman quote. And Cy had a way of saying a lot in a few words. The radio station should be a mirror to the community.
Yep.
And that was part of his driving philosophy. There are a lot of other short Cy quotes I could give you, but time is of the essence here, and as a radio broadcaster, I have to respect that. The other thing I'll say is that for those who are here in the audience, there's a take-home piece here. I copied today the program from May 15th, 1937, Jamestown High School. WJTN, under new ownership, had joined the NBC Blue Network, which eventually became ABC a decade or so later. And this was a great celebration to welcome network radio to Jamestown for the first time. The celebrated speaker at that time was Robert H. Jackson. It is in the center that bears his name that we speak at this moment. He was an assistant attorney general in the antitrust division at that time, well-known in the community and around the country, and I suspect by that point maybe around the world as well. He made a great speech, which is available for anyone to view and read on the Robert H. Jackson Center's website, or in Kristen McMahon, the president of this center's, hand right now, because she has a copy of it that she has been looking at as we have been speaking here. But I would encourage you, at 1937, Jackson's reflections on radio and the community and life at that time are very interesting and provocative, and I would encourage anybody to take a look at that.
And as we draw closure with Mike, this 1937 piece, which is a masterful job of Dennis Webster today, remembering it, and most importantly, finding it. And with mention of Jackson here at the Jackson Center, mention of Mayor Sam Carlson as a representative here, Arthur Bester of Chautauqua Institution, and it tied in virtually everything humanly possible, and most importantly, the WJTN staff, and they mentioned at the top of it, and not in alphabetical order, which was most interesting, one, Cy Goldman. I think that Colonel Wilder, who was the president of James Broadcasting, probably was pretty prescient when he put together or reviewed or agreed to this program, noting the staff was Goldman, Burdick, Callison, and others, but Goldman was at the top, and he continued to be at the top. What's your sense of all this, Mike, now that...
Well, first of all, you know, the great thing my father taught me was how to be community-oriented. I mean, the great thing is I have been able to live and be a part of this community since the day I was born. And that, and the public service and everything you talked about, that's all from my father. And I think that attitude or was part of the reason that all of these great people were able to work for the radio station and why the radio station was successful.
Thank you, Mr. Goldman. Opinions expressed are those of the WJTN editorial board, and for them, the station takes full responsibility.
Well, talk about taking full responsibility. The Chautauqua Region Community Foundation is thrilled to announce Radio Remembrances, a special program featuring Dennis Webster, Terry Frank, and Mike Goldman. With a combined 150 years of broadcasting and radio business experience, these iconic voices will share captivating stories and behind-the-scenes anecdotes. Mission accomplished. Thank you, all three of you.
Thank you.
Good to see you.
However, the last thing they're going to do, they're going to sign this program, and then in turn, we'll give it to the Chautauqua Region Community Foundation, and I have a Sharpie for this.
Oh, don't use my own, huh?
Yeah, or you can make an offer, and that would fund the entire day.
While they are signing the program, I wanted to wrap up and close. Corey had another obligation this evening, so as the host, I get to do this part. I actually started my college career at a non-Syracuse university. I don't think I've ever had that many in a row here. Most of the time at St. Bonaventure in radio news. And it was always driven home to me that importance of being that community voice and being prepared. And I have to say, although Greg did my first official interview in Jamestown, I believe the day after I was hired, Dennis was my next official interview and remained a good friend and collaborator with the Jackson Center, allowing us to really get our message out, and I deeply appreciate how welcoming he was to me. He referenced Jackson's 1937 speech, and I want to leave you with a few of those words. The radio has brought the world to the fireside of the humblest home. It is a godsend to the shut-in, to the indisposed, and to all who are homebound by temperament or necessity. Gorgeous pageants resound in homes of the poor today that even the rich could not enjoy before. It has annihilated space. What radio may yet do for the world teases the imagination. Jamestown now takes its place in the radio world with a modern broadcasting station of its own. It can speak to its neighbors in a clear and understandable voice. The message of the public man or advertiser and organizations that wish to reach their membership can now be heard. On the other hand, our own local station will bring the news and the music of the world surely and clearly to our dials. For this, we are grateful to the radio organization, which is now one of our local institutions. Would you please join me in thanking Terry and Dennis and Mike and Greg for moderating this evening.
Distinguished personalities, I'm nobody but just another listener, other than the fact that I'm older than a lot of the listeners. And WJTN was always a big part of our life. Growing up, my grandmother, I think, was the biggest fan, and I don't know if she even gave it a thought that there might be someplace else on the dial there. And I can remember back into the 40s, and WJTN used to have programs, syndicated programs, network programs on in the evening. And in those days, the network programs came in the mail. Am I right, Dennis, with these 16-inch discs? So at the end of every one, they'd say, "This program was brought to you by electrical transcription." And that meant those discs. And there was the Lone Ranger, the Green Hornet, the Shadow, that competed with television. We got our television in April '49, and so I'm listening to the radio in the evening, so it was that time or earlier. And Lone Ranger, I know, was a favorite of mine. He was always in some particular location, and our house was full of National Geographic maps, so I'd always find that. It's this tiny little dot somewhere on a National Geographic map. And I remember Jim Roselli, it seems to me he had the afternoon music program, the Record Room, I think they called it. And I absolutely fell in love with 78 RPM records, which a lot of people alive today, they wouldn't know what I'm talking about. But I used to marvel, I think about this Record Room, that was the name of this program, and I think of this room where this infinity of these glorious, wonderfully tactile 78 RPM records were there in infinity. You could just touch any of them. And I remember Doc Webster very, very well. We were farming, and we'd come in and just get started with chores about the time Doc would come on the air. But first they'd have the morning devotions with Dr. Paul A. Westerberg, pastor of Jamestown's First Lutheran Church. And boy, I'll tell you, he sounded like a radio preacher. I mean, he had the deepest voice. He even outvoiced George Flieger. And I remember George, and I remember J. Ralph Carlson, Radio Scrapbook, and all those, and Melville Weber. And of course, in later years, they had Ray Hall. And Ray was a good friend of mine, and he deserves a mention because he had to be one of the most colorful characters that Jamestown has ever had. He was from Oklahoma, as if anybody wouldn't know. And at least according to him, he ran away from home and he joined the circus. Am I going on too long?
Well, I wonder if this, because you had written all this down, it might make sense for us to try and send it to the audience so they can read it, so you don't have to do it all from memory as well.
Let me put in a plug. This portion of the program is brought to you by the County Historian's Office, and I do work with volunteers, and Andrew Hill has told me that I could go up into the attic and catalog the tapes that are up there, and if anyone would like to volunteer for that project, I'll see what I can arrange. I'm sorry about that.
I lost that one.